So, in case you haven't been let in on the worst kept secret in gaming, Valve is officially making a new game, and it's in the MOBA genre called Deadlock. It's currently in a closed alpha state, but if you go to the subreddit or just have a friend that has already gotten access to it, it's pretty easy to get in. And I gotta say that I have been loving this game so far, which is pretty impressive considering that I've never really been a big fan of the MOBA genre. I like to think of myself as a pretty open-minded gamer. I like playing tons of different kinds of games, from shooters to platformers to racing games to RPGs and just all kinds of different genres and styles and whatnot. But one genre that has always been kind of a blind spot to me is the real-time strategy genre, or RTS games. I can handle turn-based strategies usually pretty well, but I think I just get overwhelmed with RTS games or something, having to do everything in real time. And of course, the entire MOBA genre is pretty much a direct offshoot that originally was popularized as a mod to various RTS games like Warcraft and whatnot. So it makes sense that my blind spot would kind of extend to cover MOBAs as well. And yet, despite all that, I've been super interested in Deadlock and I've been having a ton of fun playing it. So that kind of makes me curious. What is it about Deadlock's take on the MOBA genre specifically that has managed to capture my interest and enjoyment so much more than other MOBAs in the genre, like League of Legends or Heroes of the Storm and whatnot? How has Deadlock fixed the MOBA genre for me? After all, I know that I am far from the only person who is not the biggest fan of MOBA games. I took a poll a little while ago before writing this video to get some other opinions on what specific issues people have with MOBAs, and by all means, feel free to chime in below if you have anything else that you don't like about the genre, like laning or last hitting and things like that. After all, the more info the better, and maybe I'll make a follow-up to this video if there's things that I don't talk about that people mention down below. But first things first, I think that we might as well talk about the most obvious change that Deadlock has made. The fact that this game looks and plays like a third-person shooter instead of an RTS game. And that's pretty significant, although it is hardly the first MOBA to try such a thing. After all, I think it's pretty well known that Smite also took this approach in trying to format a MOBA more like a third-person shooter. Although, at the same time, it's worth pointing out that Deadlock is pulling far more numbers during a closed alpha than Smite ever has, so clearly there must be more to it than just this simple change in perspective. Well, for one, this does address a couple of the things that I've seen people criticize about MOBAs. Some of the people I polled said that the overhead RTS perspective just feels a bit too disconnected from the battlefield. It feels less like they're controlling a character, and more like there's some kind of outside commander giving the character instructions. Which, I mean, that is basically the premise of almost every RTS game, so that does make sense. Thus, by shifting the perspective to be a lot more down on the ground with this third-person shooter style, it fosters a stronger connection between the player and their character. Though, let's be honest, that is pretty much a very surface-level observation. Another note that some people mentioned in those critiques is that some people wanted more control over their character and more ability for, like, creative expression and how they perform the actions in the game. To use a more blunt example, for example, in most MOBAs, you rarely have any kind of movement or mobility mechanics unless the character you're playing as has some specific movement ability that is unique to them. I think that Smite actually provides a pretty solid comparison in just how the third-person shooter perspective is used between these games. After all, just look at the gameplay of these games side by side. Now, as I implied earlier, I am by no means an expert on any MOBA that I talk about. Hell, I wouldn't even consider myself an expert on Deadlock, given that I only started playing it a couple weeks ago. But just based on my first impressions, I gotta say that I feel like Deadlock is using its third-person shooter style in a lot more interesting ways than Smite is. Maybe it's just a bad map that I'm looking at, but it seems like Smite is still a very flat game. The map is still very much designed like a map would be in a game like League of Legends, and so it's still full of wide open corridors with minimal obstacles and almost no verticality, if any at all. Meanwhile, just look at the map in Deadlock. There's so much going on here. Like, there's tons of obstacles around that you can use for cover. There's various bridges and other ledges that you can climb on top of to get high ground over your opponents. I mean, hell, those giant buildings that wall off each lane aren't just giant walls. You can actually climb on top of them and fight people up there if you want. And this isn't just for show either. The added depth in the map's complexity can provide some subtle tactical advantages to act as a sort of soft comeback mechanic. Like, if you look at the middle of any given lane, it's obviously very neutral and symmetrical. It's pretty much 100% fair on both sides. But as soon as you get to even just the first tower, and especially beyond that point, the defenders are given like the high ground and have more places to take cover and sneak around behind their opponents defense, which is all stuff that you don't really see much in other MOBAs. And then on top of that, every character by default has a stamina meter, and then that can be used to do a bunch of things like double jump, dash, air dash, slide, wall jump, and probably even more things that I don't know about yet. Basically, Deadlock is directly addressing the sorts of issues that I mentioned by giving players more options and how they control their character's movement, while also providing an absolute playground of a map to explore with those movement options. Don't get me wrong, I still think Deadlock is a MOBA-ass MOBA, but these kinds of mechanics being added to the game helps make the game more familiar to people that play shooters primarily, while also providing them with a bunch of mechanics that they might find a lot more engaging and familiar than the normal MOBA gameplay of mostly just clicking on minions and having your hero shoot them for you. But let's talk about those MOBA-ass MOBA mechanics, because I'm sure that you know that there are a number of them that many people object to greatly, whether you like MOBAs or not. To start with, I think that one of the most infamous MOBA tropes is the idea of last hitting. So, to fill in the gaps for anybody that might be unaware, last hitting is essentially the main mechanic that you need to worry about in the early game in most MOBAs. The main goal at first is to try and get as many resources as possible, and you do so by killing enemy minions, but you specifically need to get the killing blow on those minions, or the last hit, if you will, which gives you gold, which you then use to upgrade your character. Now, this sounds simple enough at first, but it has a surprising amount of depth, and it's incredibly important to not mess it up. For one, you don't get any gold at all if you miss the last hit, so it's really punishing if you mess it up, which can easily frustrate new players. On top of that, there's the fact that only one person can get the last hit, which can breed toxicity if you're laning with another person, because now, people that are supposed to be on the same team might end up competing for resources. Now, sure, obviously on a coordinated team that knows what they're doing, you can plan ahead and allocate resources accordingly. But again, a new player isn't necessarily going to know to do that, especially when playing with complete randos they don't know. So finally, some games even let you deny kills to your enemy. Essentially, you can kill your own minions before your enemy manages to do it themselves. This doesn't usually get you any resources, but it at least stops your opponent from getting resources, and it just adds yet another layer of complexity to worry about. And on top of this, there's also just the way that all this information is presented to the player. You essentially need to keep track of all of these various life bars around your character all at once, and you need to be able to time everything with your character's auto attack speed, which can be awkward to pull off with how these games control. So yeah, there's a lot to not like about last hitting, especially as a new player. I mean, for a while, Heroes of the Storm was my favorite MOBA, specifically just because it got rid of last hitting as a mechanic. But I do think that Deadlock's take on the system has managed to make it a lot more intuitive and palatable, and generally just reduce a lot of the frustration based around it. So what exactly does Deadlock change? Well, first of all, resources are now always shared between teammates in a lane, so you don't have to worry about a teammate accidentally kill-stealing souls from you. If you collect souls, then your teammate also gets those souls, and I think that that alone can help reduce a significant amount of toxicity. I also think that in general, the presentation of the minions is a lot clearer than most MOBAs. In addition to the health bars, these minions have big candles for heads that burn out in accordance with their life bar, which I think makes it a lot easier to spot at a glance when a minion is close to death just from their silhouette, which is of course further enhanced by the fact that you're a lot closer and down on the ground as opposed to this big over-the-top, perspective like most RTS games. Plus, when they get low on health, their health bar even changes color to help draw your eye towards them. And then, on top of that, even if you miss the last hit, minions actually stick around for just a couple seconds while they're dying, during which time they can still be attacked to claim the last hit for full credit. So just, in general, these kinds of quality of life features I think just make it easier to keep track of all the minions in play, who's low on health, and you can just do that even as a brand new player. But on top of that, they've also changed last hitting into a two-step process. So you still need to get the killing blow as usual, but you've probably noticed that you have these weird little glowing orbs popping out of all of the minions. So when you get the killing blow, that only gets you half of the resources from that minion. The other half are spawned as a soul orb that slowly floats up towards the sky. Now, if the orb is ignored, it eventually fades away and then it'll award the rest of the souls to your team. But before that happens, anyone on both teams can shoot it to claim the souls for themselves. And I think that this is a way more intuitive way of handling the deny mechanic that I mentioned earlier. For one, you don't have to shoot your own minions, which is like, that just feels wrong on a fundamental level, so I appreciate that change. It's also very obvious when it happens because there's a giant glowing orb in the sky. And in general, I think that this just plays very well into the more shooter side of things, since, well, it's another thing to aim and shoot at. And while having all of your orbs denied would suck, at the very least you're not completely left out to dry because, like I said, you still get half of your resources from the kill on its own. Plus, if you kill a minion with a melee hit, which all heroes in this game can do, then you automatically collect the soul orb instantly, which offers some slightly riskier counterplay options if the enemy is really good at denying you. But yeah, overall, I think that there is a reason why Valve is the prototypical example of good conveyance through visual design. The information here is, I think, a lot more readable than it is in most MOBAs. The mechanic is a lot more forgiving in general, and there's fewer ways for it to breed toxicity. And I think that just overall, it's way more intuitive to shoot low health minions with a gun than it is to use auto attacks in this sort of weird RTS format. Like I said, I used to prefer HOTS just for getting rid of last hitting, but now I actually feel like I can see the value in the mechanic thanks to this game. Speaking of Heroes of the Storm, though, there was another mechanic that game essentially removed that most MOBAs have, which is the shop system. Now, this is definitely another sticking point for a lot of people. The shop is just a massive information barrier that almost immediately scares off so many new players. There's so many items that are just thrown at the player right away, while also being arguably the most important aspect of the game, since it's basically the entire way that you upgrade your character. And as a result, a new player either has to just sit down and basically read through hours worth of material to try and understand what this whole mess even is, which, let's be honest, almost nobody wants to do, or you basically have to just go with whatever items are recommended to you without really understanding what you're doing. And that often makes it profoundly difficult to actually move on to any kind of deeper engagement with the shop system. It essentially just pushes the problem down the road. So, like I said, I enjoyed HOTS for essentially removing the shop system entirely in favor of a very straightforward talent system, where each character had a choice of 3 or 4 talents once every few levels, and that was pretty much it. But I think that Deadlock has once again managed to find a balance between making the system much more comprehensible while also maintaining a significant variety of depth. So, for one, there are just fewer items in total in Deadlock compared to most MOBAs. Both League and Dota have over 200 items that you can buy in their shop, while Deadlock has around half as many of those other games. Additionally, they've gotten rid of consumable items entirely. There are still items that you can activate at will, but there's nothing like those potions that you can use for a one-time heal before you have to rebuy them, which I always personally found really annoying to manage. Then, they have split up the list of items into 3 very distinct categories: weapon, vitality, and spirit. And instead of having an inventory that you can fill with however many items of each type, you instead have inventories specifically for each of those item types. So you have 12 inventory slots in total, which is way more than most MOBAs have, but you can only hold 4 items of each type. So you can't just load up a tank with 12 vitality items and become an unkillable god. Another thing that's really nice is that all of their items of their respective type give you a flat bonus to that stat in addition to whatever other bonuses they grant you. So, for example, all 500 cost vitality items increase your base health by 11%, and all 3000 cost vitality items give you plus 17% vitality. So, even if you have no goddamn idea what you're doing with the shop, as long as you're buying items of a specific category, you can at least understand that you're increasing your damage, health, or ability damage by that set amount, which I think is simple enough for even someone like me to understand when they're just getting started. Finally, something that more MOBAs really need to do, in my opinion, is support online build sharing. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that this mostly started with League. Essentially, people would post various build orders that they preferred for whatever characters they play, so that more novice players could just look up what items they should buy on like a wiki or something, and just keep that tab open on a second monitor for reference. This eventually evolved into making a full-blown third-party overlay for League that tells you what items to buy in-game, which is even more helpful. But I don't think that this was ever officially supported, and as such, you can't really expect new players to be installing add-ons for a game that they already barely even understand to play, so it doesn't really help out the new player experience all that much. Cut to Valve, however, who also makes Dota 2, and they ended up creating a similar system that lets you create and share builds with other players, except that they actually made it completely available in-game, which makes it way better for helping out new players. And as such, they've carried that onto Deadlock, which also has this kind of online build sharing feature built in. And I think that this is a pretty big deal, because yeah, like I said, you could use a third-party add-on for League or other MOBAs, but I think that going up to someone and being like, hey, you should check out this game. Also, if you want to understand anything that's happening, you need to mod the game with this third-party tool to play it properly. Like, that kind of makes the premise a bit of a hard sell to me. Whereas officially including such tools in the game itself, I think makes it a lot easier to comprehend. Now you can just be like, don't sweat if you don't understand the shop, just hit browse builds and use whatever's popular for now. And like, having to install a third-party add-on to get this kind of feature is kind of silly and insane to me, if I'm being honest. And like I said, asking for a brand new player to mod their game or have a wiki open while they play, that's not going to be great for the new player experience. Plus, it's worth noting that the builds in Deadlock can actually be very detailed and helpful. This McGinnis build that I started with actually has a ton of comments on almost every item listed that explains exactly why you want them and what it does for you. And these kinds of detailed explanations really helped me get a grasp on the character and the game as a whole. Sure, not every build is going to be this in-depth, but the fact that they can be, all with completely in-game tools, is really nice. But finally, one other aspect of the shop that they have greatly simplified is the nature of item crafting. And I gotta be real here, maybe I'm just a bit too smooth-brained for this, but I feel like games like League have gone way too far in how complex they've made item crafting. I mean, just look at some of these things. Shit like the Abyssal Mask requires you to buy 3 different items, which you then craft into 2 more items before finally crafting those items into the actual mask itself. Or the Blade of the Ruined King, which requires you to buy a longsword and a dagger, upgrade those into a vampiric scepter and a recurve bow, but then also buy a random pickaxe for some reason before finally combining all of that into a big sword, I guess? Like, there's no obvious logical through line for what items craft into other items, at least not to a new player. There's literally dozens and dozens of these items that you can only get through crafting, and recipes are so complicated that I refuse to believe that even an experienced player has managed to memorize anything beyond whatever items they build the most for their main. Like, this has got to be the most unnecessary way to arrange the store possible, and again, for comparison, Deadlock does have item progressions where you have to buy another item before getting the upgraded version, but it is so much simpler and easier to understand. For one, there are just way fewer craftable items compared to normal items that stand on their own. And like, secondly, there's only ever like one step. Like, if you want improved burst, you need Mystic Burst. If you want improved spirit, you need extra spirit, and so on. There's only ever one prerequisite for each item, which also means that the item itself can have a very simple little icon on it that tells you what the prereq is without having to look it up or read an item description. This is admittedly a case where I think that all they've really done is greatly simplify the concept. Like, there's just fewer items to craft in the game, but like I said, I honestly feel like item crafting has just gone way too far in games like League. Like, this feels like it would be more in line with like a 40-hour long JRPG, not a 1-hour long PvP match. Do we really need items that require you to buy 6 other items as prerequisites to the point where you can't possibly memorize the dozens and dozens of items that work this way without hundreds of hours of gameplay and a wiki open on the side? Like, I think that the Deadlock version here is perfectly adequate. So, to recap what we've gone over so far, Deadlock styles itself as a third-person shooter instead of an RTS, while also incorporating a lot more familiar movement mechanics to better appeal to those kinds of players. And the map is designed to help out the losing team so that they have more of a chance to make a comeback. The last hitting mechanic that pretty much all players will be faced with in the early game is made a lot more visually intuitive and less punishing than most MOBAs. And the shop system, I think, is a lot better organized, and it's greatly simplified in certain ways to make it less of a massive information wall so that new players don't have to bash their heads against it. Not to mention that the online build sharing feature is a huge boon to help people learn how the game works. But there's a few more clever little details that I think they've implemented that I think also helps out new players while helping reduce toxicity by a lot, which MOBAs are pretty infamous for. So, for instance, in a game like League, and I know I'm using League of Legends as a comparison point a lot, but it's kind of the MOBA to compare things to, but yeah, so League has very specific roles for your team, not unlike the positions in a sport like soccer or football. The lane you're in and what kind of hero you're playing results in you needing to fill a very specific role for your team, and if you're a brand new player that's not very familiar with those roles, you can get very easily frustrated or frustrate your teammates and the other more experienced players. Meanwhile, Deadlock seems to be trying to design their heroes to be be a lot less specifically tied to any given role. Like, yeah, Abrams is always going to be tanky, and Hayes is always going to be shooty, and Lash is always going to be an asshole, but for example, if you want to play support, any character can buy a cheap item that lets you cast a heal on yourself or an ally on a cooldown, which can be upgraded and buffed by other items as usual. So, at least to my untrained eye, it feels like the characters in Deadlock are built to be a lot more flexible in the roles that they can fill. If you need a tank, you can buy tank items for yourself. If you need a support, you can buy support items. But also, the way that they've handled lanes I think helps make things more straightforward too. Unlike most MOBAs, Deadlock actually has 4 lanes instead of 3, which you might think makes the game more complicated, but instead of having 3 unique lanes that are each different from each other, the 4 lanes are actually just 2 types of lanes that are mirrored on either side. So if you actually really prefer one kind of lane over the other, you at least have a 50-50 shot of getting assigned to it. But even then, the lanes don't really have too much of a functional difference in my opinion, at least not to the same extent as League. So right now, it seems like most everyone is fine being thrown into whatever lane the game assigns them. Speaking of getting thrown into a lane, they also got rid of the prep phase where everyone has to argue over who gets to play what character and be in which lane. Instead, when you queue up to play, you're required to pick a minimum of 3 characters that you want to play as, and then the game assigns you a character and a lane without you needing to consult your teammates. Now, sure, it can be frustrating if you want to play as one specific character only, and then you get assigned someone else, but I think it's way more frustrating to have the character taken from you by another player who refuses to give it up because they want to really play them too. Plus, you can still set priority level so that you can at least bias which character you want to play. And just in general, I think that this makes for a much smoother experience, at least for newer players. You can just queue up for a game and not have to worry about coordinating with your team on who has to go where and do what and what so on and so forth. Like I said, a new player is just not going to know anything about anyways. Now, maybe if they add a ranked mode, this sort of prep phase with your team might return in some form or another, but that is yet to be seen. But yeah, I think that this video is already getting long enough, so I think I'll cut my analysis off here for now. But like I said, I think that Deadlock is already doing a lot of good things to help open up the MOBA genre to more people like me who don't necessarily like traditional MOBAs. I think that one could maybe argue that they're just quote-unquote dumbing down some of the MOBA mechanics to make them easier or simpler like Heroes of the Storm did, but I honestly think that these changes go beyond that. Sure, some aspects of the game, like the item crafting that I talked about, are just objectively simpler, but I think that a lot of what they're doing here can be better described as just sort of interpreting the mechanics in a meaningfully new and unique way that might be more intuitive for different kinds of players. And it's kind of crazy how much they've already accomplished in this regard, despite the game being in such an early alpha. And I mean, that is also an important point worth remembering. This game is in an alpha state right now, so a lot of things are due to change in the future, potentially for the better or even for the worse. For example, right now, I think that the number of items in the shop and the number of heroes in the game are both small enough to not be overwhelming, but we have no idea how many heroes the game will end up launching with on release, or if they might end up adding more items in the future with more complicated crafting systems and things like that. I mean, hell, apparently League of Legends started with an absolutely minuscule 17 champions, which I think Deadlock already has more than. So these sorts of issues are ones that can easily get worse with time, depending on how it's managed in the long run. But by that same measure, for all we know, they might have other great ideas just waiting in the wings that will only end up making the game better. Only time will tell. And like I said, I know I wasn't able to talk about every single complaint that people have with the MOBA genre, so as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. So if you're like me and you're not a fan of normal MOBAs, let me know what issues you've ran into with the genre, and maybe I'll make a follow-up talking about how Deadlock addresses those complaints, and hell, even if it doesn't, now is the best time to let the devs know about those issues because the game is still being developed. So if you raise your complaints now, then they still have a chance to make the game even better in the future. But for now, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw, make sure to leave me a like. If you want to see me make more videos like this, then you should subscribe and ring the bell to get notified of future uploads. And if you really want to help me out, then you can donate to my Ko-Fi to help me keep doing what I'm doing. But as always, thank you again for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.